Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining this webinar jointly held by Thales and Juniper Research, titled Driving Successful Digital Identity Strategies, What are the main drivers for an effective approach? So what will we explore in this particular webinar? Well, firstly, we'll look at some drivers that are really driving digital identity adoption, and really looking at the efficient and effective way that digital identity strategies are playing out, and some key things to note there. This, of course, will be done by Juniper Research, so we'll be giving these viewpoints from the research and analysis that we have done and conducted for a while now. Number two, we'll be looking and moving over to Thales. They'll be giving a keynote on digital identity and some of the trends and developments that they are seeing in that space, as well as the activities that they are undertaking in that sector as well. And lastly, for number three, we will be holding a Q&A session with expert panelists, both from Thales as well as Juniper Research, on this topic of digital identity. And I'd like to introduce two key speakers that will be giving presentations in the next few moments. The first is Nick Maynard. He is Juniper Research's lead analyst covering the fintech, identity, and payment sector. After his presentation, we will have Fabrice Bordeaux from Thales, the Senior Vice President Strategy, M&A, and Product Policy, and he heads up the Digital Identity and Security Business Unit at Thales. After Nick and Fabrice's presentations and insights, we will be holding the panel discussion, as earlier mentioned. And for that, there'll be three key people from Thales joining, namely Arjen Hollander, who comes from the Banking and Payment Services business line of Thales, Pauline Pinzuti, who comes from Thales's Mobile Connectivity Solutions business line, and last but not least, Crystal Terrias, who comes from Identity and Biometric Solutions business line of Thales. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Nick Maynard to present on digital identity. Over to you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Elson. It's great to be here talking to you today about digital identity and the drivers and strategies therein. This is a hugely important area, and I think it's only going to become more important over time. We've seen a lot of development in a short space of time, but also I think we're only really starting to see the huge level of innovation that digital identity can bring. So I think it's going to be a really interesting few months and years ahead. So firstly, let's arrive at a common definition of digital identity, because as with any concept, there are a lot of competing definitions with digital identity. So we define digital identity as a technological link between a real entity, such as a person, and its digital equivalent entities. It includes a collection of electronically captured and stored identity attributes, including biographic and biometric data. And it's really important to establish that at the start, because there has been a lot of discussion as to what is digital identity and what isn't. So that's what we're saying there. So let's look at some of the key drivers behind the growth of digital identity. We've picked out four, but there's an enormous amount of drivers here. And really what we're seeing is a confluence of many different trends have led to such an increase in the interest in digital identity services. So let's look at digital transformation in banking first. So banks for years have been closing branches. They've been changing how they operate to be a more digital model. And that's really been with competition from digital-only banks and innovative new players in the banking sector who have really disrupted that market. So there's been a pressure for digital transformation for quite a while. And what we're seeing now is that that is really coming to the fore, and the pandemic hasn't created digital transformation, but it's accelerated that existing trend. So what we're really seeing now is that all banks, be that traditional banks, digital-only banks, are really focusing on that digital experience. And really, digital identity is so crucial to providing that effective digital experience. So it's really important that is considered for this. Again, in a similar vein, in the shift to e-government, so in government services, there has been a long-standing shift towards increasing the level of digitization. And really, what this means is that when citizens are empowered with digital identity services, they can access all kinds of services in a digital fashion. And again, what the pandemic has done is it's boosted the need to do that with a lot of in-person ways to access services not being favoured. So really that's come to the fore, and that's being supported by capabilities such as document reading via NFC, which is a real accelerator in this space. Changes in retail, again, have been important here. It will come as a surprise to no one that traditional bricks and mortar retail has been struggling for a long time. What we've seen is the rise of e-commerce has had a really big impact there. And that rise means that retailers need to change and challenge their existing methods of servicing customers. That means more omni-channel. That means more digital engagement, and it means more personalization. And that, again, is where digital identity can come in and can provide value. And again, another set of changes we're seeing is changes for mobile network operators. And they have a lot of similar challenges to banks in terms of they're having to operate remotely. They're having to offer more digital services, and they're having to do so in a way that is secure, which is an ongoing challenge. So as those distribution models change, we are seeing that they are having to employ new strategies. And again, digital identity is a really valuable approach there, and that's why it's driving the use of digital identity in that particular space. And that's a topic we're going to touch on more later. So then a particular driver that we've pulled out for specific analysis is fraud. So a lot's been said about the pandemic and payment fraud, and it is really difficult to actually overstate it. What we've seen is that the pandemic has been a massive accelerator to fraud attempts, to fraudulent activities. And really that has followed the explosion of e-commerce growth. The fraudsters have followed the money, and they followed the transactions, and that has translated into increased risk in the payment fraud area. So what that means is that stakeholders throughout the payments ecosystem need to adjust how they are operating to ensure that they can do so in a secure way. So a contributing factor here is data breaches. They're continuing at a very rapid pace. And what we're seeing is that they're being used to fuel synthetic identity use and account takeover fraud, which are really painful for merchants and can be really difficult to deal with. And new users in the online environment, both in terms of merchants who haven't offered e-commerce before, and in terms of those users who are new to an e-commerce ecosystem, they both are in a position where they are unfamiliar with the e-commerce environment. So that is that creates risk, that generates risks for the environment, and that's something stakeholders are going to have to adapt to. One way they can do that is with changing the way they operate to involve greater use of digital identity verification. And that is going to be a major step in how to combat this significant rise in online payment fraud attempts that we have seen. So let's talk a bit more about the strategies. I think we're at a position now where we can really understand the drivers here. But let's look a bit at the strategies that are at play. So really for us and from our point of view, digital identity verification, it has to be made up of three key areas to be 100% effective in securing this new digital ecosystem, which is pretty difficult for vendors to navigate. And this is really three elements. So onboarding, high-risk transactions, and risk management. So onboarding is the element that always comes up. It's the one that people think of when they look at digital identity. And really, what we're seeing is massive improvements in how onboarding can be carried out with liveness detection and selfie scans, and all sorts of different elements are really leading to improvements in the digital onboarding capabilities. That is sort of the building block of everything else. And if you look at high-risk transactions, that again needs to be where some of those methods are utilized again in order to ensure that that continuous cycle of verification is met and really supported by all the different elements in the ecosystem. High-risk transactions as well, they need to be identified by risk management. And that means wherever transactions are going on, there is this risk of these fraudulent transactions. So these systems have to be able to actively risk manage, have to be able to identify potential issues and then navigate that and deal with that. So that's where the risk management comes in. So really what it requires is a holistic digital user experience focused approach to how to orchestrate all of these different requirements and all of these different methods for verification. And if vendors implement one of these methods or don't consider all of these requirements, then that will not result in the best business outcomes. And really there needs to be a strategy alongside digital transformation strategies. So let's have a look at the traditional verification process. So this is sort of the existing model of digital identity verification. There's an application made to use services digitally. Identity is verified using a selfie with government-issued ID. Access to services is approved or rejected based on the validity of documents. And critically, that can be either a manual review by a person, or it can be a assisted review using an AI system. And then the user either transacts or is rejected. So that is the traditional verification process, and that is useful to an extent. But really what it needs to do is it needs to move on from that. What we're looking at is the ideal verification process in terms of how to best make use of digital identity verification. So looking at this, again, we have the same similar flow to start with. So an application is used to make services, to access services digitally. The identity is verified. That can be by a selfie, using NFC to read documents, can be device verification. There are any number of verification methods that can be leveraged there. And then access to services is approved, rejected, or additional steps are taken to verify that identity. Ultimately, what that means is that risk management then needs to come in. And what we need to generate here is a cycle of continuous verification, where at every stage, these identities are re-verified on a risk-assessed basis as they need to be to secure the whole ecosystem. And really what that will enable is a increased security across the piece, and will enable actually a better user experience, as that user's identity will be better known throughout the whole process. And really this is what we see as the model for the best way to integrate digital identity verification into a business. So let's have a look at some key segments and key use cases for digital identity and what strategies are going on there. So really, digital identity when you talk about digital identity, a lot of people will think government services, and that's not wrong. Government services is foundational to how digital identity works, but also it's part of a wider ecosystem. Banking and payments, for example, is a massive user of digital identity and will be a even bigger user of digital identity. Governments will change what they do with digital identity. They will become more advanced in terms of their identity use and in creating a platform for other people to use it. And mobile network operators will really leverage identity, both as a way to secure their own operations, but as an additional revenue stream. And ultimately, what we see here is that these individual segments, they're all part of this wider digital identity ecosystem. These segments don't stand on their own. They're part of this wider network. And it's only when you connect all the data sources from as many elements as possible, that's when you get the best benefit in terms of the digital identity outcome for that business. So let's start with banking and financial services. Now, this is a really interesting area, and this is something that gets talked about very frequently in terms of digital identity and what it can do. So let's set the scene a little. Thinking, as we did at the start of this webinar, about digital transformation in banking. That has been a really important driver, and those traditional banks are really seeing what they have to do to catch up to new vendors in the space. And digital identity can be a real leveler in terms of that. So let's have a look at some of those individual elements. Robust biometric verification. So it's the era of logging into a bank with a password and those basic checks is really beyond us. And what we're seeing now is that biometrics such as face, fingerprint, all sorts of different elements are being used to verify identity. And that's really important. But it's important to make sure that that is robust, and that's part of a wider strategy at a bank. So we're now in an era where via open banking and via all sorts of different API connections, a bank can be a jumping off point to access to so many other services. But foundational to that is getting the strategy right about onboarding. If somebody is using an open banking payment via that bank, essentially that responsibility for ensuring that that identity is valid, that is on the part of the bank. So unlocking a wider ecosystem of value for those banks, that starts with robust biometric verification, which is really important to ensuring that those banking services in themselves are secure, but all the other types of access that can be had with banks is again secure. And additional verification as well. So ensuring that not only are you verified when you open an account digitally, when you go to access an account, but you're verified when you make a high-risk transaction. You're verified when certain risk identifiers have been identified in data about your transaction behavior. Making sure that all of those elements are covered is critically important here, in making sure that this banking ecosystem is working as efficiently as it possibly can. And we talked a little about this, but traditional banks and banks who are really engaging on their digital transformation strategy, they need to be able to onboard customers in a fully digital way. That's not been something that they've traditionally had to do, but they need to be able to do that now, and the pandemic's accelerated that. So again, these services are the cornerstone of that. Clear business rules around onboarding. This is a really important one for banks and financial services. It comes back to the fact that banking and financial services is highly regulated. It operates in an environment that's dense with regulations, anti-money laundering, KYC, enhanced due diligence for politically exposed persons. The list of different types of regulation is very long in this segment. So what you need to have is you need to have clear business rules around onboarding, and you need to have explainability of how decisions are arrived at and made in order to make sure that those decisions are explainable to regulators should they ask for the reasoning behind it. So that is an absolutely critical capability, and it's something that we think will only become more important over time. And really, compliance isn't optional for banks and financial services. To operate in this digitally native way that they need to, they really need to focus on digital identity verification and getting these fundamental building blocks correct, or they are going to struggle to get the best business outcomes out of it. So moving on to government services then. So there's a lot of potential in government services, and there are a lot of use cases and new opportunities and challenges in this area that are really worth exploring. So typically what you think of with digital identity in government services will be a digital passport or a digital driving license. And those are really important foundational elements to the whole digital identity ecosystem. But really, a critical capability here is NFC document reading. And this is one that's really important in enabling government services to actually become that foundational layer for all of digital identity and really to unlock that potential. Getting that access involves quite a lot of work on the government's part. They need to set up a system where that identity can be checked and verified. They need to, in some cases, authorize third-party access and set up permissions for that. They need to set up legal frameworks. They need to set up the basis for data sharing, and those are complicated. That's not a straightforward process, and that means that governments need to have sort of taken a long-term look at what they're trying to achieve, and they need to have strategized around that. But really, there's a lot that can be achieved in terms of granting access to wider services in a secure way, and I think that's going to be a real area of growth going forward. Border and visa management, that's very important. It's a very valuable area for digital identity to be leveraged. I think it would not be a surprise to anybody in the pandemic environment that being able to verify who you are when you're traveling, being able to verify your validity to enter a country, being able to verify your COVID vaccination status, those things have become even more important than they have been in past. So fundamentally sorting those border and visa management systems so that they work effectively has become more important than ever. And I think that's something we are seeing a lot of progress on now. Again, there are some issues around legal frameworks and ensuring that the sets of rules are right, but there's real potential here to make real benefits for users. And again, biometrics, these are again important. Accessing those government services online using digital identity, you need to do that using biometrics to ensure that security is there. So that is, again, really important to how this is working, and it's something that needs to be considered by governments of how they secure and verify using biometrics. And really, government use cases are absolutely critical to the use of digital identity. They're the basis. Choosing the right vendor if you're a government and ensuring that these vendors are capable of delivering the orchestration requirements you have, that's really important, and it requires that vendor with that broad set of capabilities. So looking at the mobile network operator market, so as I mentioned earlier, this is quite similar to banking in some ways. You've got the account onboarding and ongoing verification challenges. They need to onboard their customers in an efficient way. They need to get them online. They need to get them set up. They need to check all of their details, and they need to make sure that it's not fraudulent, that they're not shipping devices that are going to be stolen, that all of these measures are in place to secure this ecosystem. And digital identity verification gives them capabilities in this area that they've not really previously had. So there's a lot of value in there. Also looking at subscriber identity. So we've all seen, I'm sure, developments around Mobile Connect and the ability to use subscriber identity. That's been something that's gone on for a few years now. But under a newer system of digital identity use at a wider rate in society, then MNOs have a real opportunity to act as a sort of guarantor and originator of a lot of data in the digital identity space. So that can create an additional revenue stream for them. And it's something MNOs really need to have a strategy around. It's important, and it's something that they really need to consider. Also, the other element of identity that is happening in this space is with IoT. We all know how critical the IoT has become to everything now, but all of those devices need to have a verified identity. You need to know that the device is correct, that what it's connecting to is correct, and you need to ensure trust in that whole system to make best use of IoT capabilities. So verification strategies are really important to that, and MNOs need to have a strategy around that can deal with the incredible levels of complexity with most IoT systems. So MNOs have a really important role. They need to strategize and they need to plan around this now, and they need to make sure that they're making best use of digital identity throughout their operations, because that's very, very important for them now in a way that it hasn't been to date. So then to look at some of the key takeaways here. So really there are three key takeaways that we think of here, but there could be 20. Digital identity is such an important area, and so much is happening here that we could talk about this forever. But looking at some of our key takeaways, orchestration is critical to success. It's not enough to have one verification method. It's not enough to have one data source. You have to have numerous levels of identification and verification. You need to have numerous data sources, and you need to be able to orchestrate all of that with a system that can actually be implemented in a operational environment, and that can be very challenging. So ensuring that you choose the right vendor that can handle all of those different capabilities and all those different requirements is really important. For all of the segments we've discussed, they are just as important as each other. Digital identity has reached a point where it's not just about government anymore. It's not just about that foundational passport, driving license, ability to verify your identity layer. It's about how digital identity can be critical to business strategies now, and how it needs to be critical to digital transformation going forward. So really, they're of equal importance now, and that's something that all vendors need to consider. And really, what we want to outline here is the transformational potential of digital identity. It can transform business models. It can really make business models work. It can really add value to what businesses are doing. And when you think about fraud, if you can truly identify a customer, if you can 100% verify who they are, then you eliminate fraud in that context. So ensuring that identity is playing a big role there can really transform how those business models work. And that's something that all vendors should really be considering going forward. So with that, that's the end of this section of the webinar, and I will be handing back over to Elson.
Thanks very much, Nick. A very insightful presentation on your findings in the digital identity space. Next, we're now going to move on to Fabrice Bordex, who heads up the security and identity business unit at Thales, who will give us an update on some of Thales's activities in this space. So over to you, Fabrice.
Thanks, Elson, and thanks very much to all of you for being with us today. Thank you, Nick, for this very detailed and exciting overview on the future of digital identity and all its potential. So I'd like to cover now kind of what we think is the journey for digital identity, for building a successful digital identity strategy now, these days, and in the few coming years. So when we talk about identity, obviously there needs to be a very high level of trust, and in this trust chain there needs to be a root of trust. And who else than governments, when it comes to identity, are this root of trust? So governments are really key at issuing identities that are more and more EIDs, that more and more include some form of digital identity. The good news is today we are moving to these physical ID documents that have some digital capabilities. And when we talk about that, we can think about NFC readable documents, smart documents, biometric included in the documents, and all these technologies that complement and that are embedded into physical documents to make them more digital. We already have more than 1 billion active e-passport worldwide. More than 60% of ID docs shipped this year are actually contactless. So we are definitely moving at high speed in this direction, where all physical ID documents will have digital capabilities. Two examples, one in Africa with the Economic Community of West African States, which facilitate cross-border travel between the member states through this NFC EID card compliant with the ICAO standard. And another one in Europe is certainly the new EID regulations that was issued in 2019 that mandates all EID cards in the EU to be based on an ICAO standard with NFC capabilities, with biometrics capabilities, MRZ readable data as well. So moving quickly towards having digital and physical documents ready. So once these documents are there, it means that we can use those documents to do a lot more. We can unlock a journey in, of course, for government. These foundational identities can be used to derive identities that will enable you to access digital services, e-government services provided by governments, as well as online services provided by other third parties. In banking and payments, these EIDs will also enable a smoother onboarding and will enable a simpler compliance with regulations such as GDPR and AML and many others. And similarly for mobile network operators, more and more SIM registration is mandatory across the world, and you need to verify ID of someone registering for a subscription at onboarding, and this is very much facilitated by a trusted digital identity. So lots of potential there. So with this digital identity, obviously, it's all about building trust, and this trust comes with we trust you to be who you pretend to be digitally, meaning when you connect, you will have a strong, trusted digital identity that will make sure nobody else is pretending to be you when connecting to a digital service, which means that you have very strong authentication, very secure authentication that avoids a misappropriation of your identity. Very important for your privacy protection, and for making sure nobody uses your identity to do something you don't want to do. Payment, obviously, strong authentication for payment is more and more required as per the PSD2 regulations, and doing it easily and frictionless is very important for the customer satisfaction. Otherwise, customers tend to not do the transaction or not subscribe or not open an account or not do what they were going to do because it's too complex, too difficult. Same thing for mobile identity. Mobile identity is a very simple way to be able to show your identity without having to carry lots of physical documents. And same thing, being able to connect to public government services. A few examples of very significant digital ID implementations that have been there since many years. In Belgium, there is a very ambitious mobile ID scheme. What is very impressive is that in about 3 years, a large percentage, about 40% of the population in Belgium has been equipped and is using the service for about 7 times a month. And it's sorted by more than 350 services provider. So short time frame to deploy, large scale deployment with many participants, and a huge success being adopted by a large part of the Belgian population. And we are extremely proud at Thales having supported Belgium to implement that. Another example is the inclusive remote ID verification in Finland, where opening e-government services to any resident and non-Finnish citizen was really a challenge. And now 80% of the government to citizen interactions are done online in Finland, which is quite impressive. By the way, certainly one of the most advanced countries in the world for that. And there, remote ID verification and onboarding of foreigners living in Finland was certainly a key challenge, which has been solved through these digital ID technologies. Last but not least, in terms of example, in Florida, being able to offer a mobile driver's license, being able, as Thales, to support this initiative and to deliver credential services provider is a quite interesting use cases. A lot of different use cases. As an example, being able to prove that you are over 21 years old, and so that you can order alcoholic beverage in a bar is an example of what you can do using your mobile driver's license in Florida. So 3 very different examples, 3 large-scale examples that show that digital ID is clearly on the way, even if it's the beginning of what will be a long journey. And so what is one of the key enabler in terms of making this possible? It's certainly the maturity level now of technologies that enable to deliver digital ID wallets that are able to carry multiple digitalized ID docs, credential sharing capability, as well as enabling authentication, strong authentications towards digital ID services. And when it comes to these digital ID wallets, I think there are 3 very key elements that you need to consider. The first one is user experience. User experience needs to be really top class, needs to be very natural, frictionless, and we're all used to all sorts of digital apps that are some great, some not so great. So you definitely need a great digital ID wallet app. The second characteristic we look at when thinking about digital ID wallet is actually for you who are digital ID issuers who want to build this kind of solutions. Is it easy to deploy? Is it easy to manage? Is it easy to maintain? What is the total cost of ownership of such a solution? So we need to make it easy for you. And last but not least, of course, you need to have the best level of security in this digital ID wallet. There would be nothing worse than the security being subpar and this trust being destroyed by the level of security provided. So these three key elements: user experience, ease of deployment, total cost of ownership, and cyber security of the solution are really the three key drivers for a successful digital ID deployment. And when we look at this digital wallet adoption, certainly the last communication of the EU, as you see on this slide, Margaret Versteger presenting during the press conference, I think it was 2 weeks ago, together with Thierry Breton, there was certainly a strong push from the EU that we certainly welcome, that says we would like to have a digital ID in the EU by 2023 that would deliver, as I was saying, great user experience, advanced cyber security, be able to offer multiple usages, be inclusive in terms of participation, and deliver user privacy. We couldn't have said better, and we certainly welcome this European Union Digital ID initiative based on digital wallet. Thank you all, and now back to you, Elson.
Thanks very much, Fabrice. Very interesting and insightful to learn of Thales's activities in this space. Right, so now we're at the point where we're going to have a Q&A and a session with the experts. So Fabrice is still with us, as well as Nick, and we're just going to welcome to the table, so to speak, Arjen Hollander, who comes from Banking and Payment Services, Pauline Pinzuti from Mobile Connectivity Solutions, and Chris Delterias, who comes from Identity and Biometric Solutions, all from Thales. So just checking that you guys are logging on. Thank you very much. Well, just as you're all logging on, I'll just pick up a few questions. And just a note here is that, we are running a bit out of time. It's a big topic, so apologies if we don't get round to your questions. We will collate them offline and get back to you if we haven't answered your question in today's session. So let's start with the first question. I'll pick one here. It is, what impact did the pandemic have on digitalization? So I think that's quite a general one. Does anyone want to start by answering that question? What impact did the pandemic have on digitalization? Any takers?
So I think, at least in the public sector, the pandemic clearly acted not only as an accelerator, but also as a wake-up call. So first of all, if we look at governments which haven't yet deployed a digital identity scheme, with the pandemic and the crisis, they have clearly realized the importance of digital ID to ensure the continuity in the delivery of public services to citizens in a remote way. And for governments who had already implemented such schemes, we have seen a clear pickup in the adoption from citizens, connecting remotely and in a secure way to online public services. And another thing as well is with the health pass and the vaccination certificate, which is being digitalized, clearly that can be a starting point for governments to move on to more ambitious digitalization of documents.
Thank you, Christel. Very, very interesting points to add there. Anyone else want to add as well?
Yes, for mobile network operators, this is as well a good accelerator. The pandemic pushed people to make more operations online for sure, and more telecom operators are now developing or considering to developing their value-added services online. So for sure, this requires strong identity verification processes and convenient one as well. As Fabrice mentioned, the user experience is really key. It needs to be easy, it needs to be frictionless, it needs to be very convenient for the end user, and of course, very, very secure to avoid fraud.
Thank you, Pauline. Very interesting to hear from the telco side. Arjun, anything to add for banks and the finance space?
Well, not only for banks in the finance space, but I think in general it has it's had a huge impact on e-commerce and therefore on spending and on the whole environment in which we live in nowadays. Everybody was forced to sort of interact with their clients and their customers in a digital manner, where a lot of these processes were still in a physical, were conducted in a physical manner. So the change is much more than only in the banking and in the M&O and in the government space. I think that we're essentially in a new situation when it comes to how we interact with clients, with consumers, with also with organizations ourselves. So digital identities, proving who people are, that people are who they say they are, that companies are who they say they are. It's been fast tracked to in a way that we couldn't have had imagined, let's say, end of 2019.
For sure. Nick, any thoughts to echo as well, following off of Arjun?
Yeah, I think it's a great point Arjun's made there. I think what we're seeing and really the difference we're seeing is that we're sort of seeing this network effect in terms of identity is become so important in so many areas that lifts the whole market. It adds value to all these different areas, and digitization has happened in all of these different sectors. We've seen it happen in banking and financial services. We've seen it for mobile network operators. We've seen it across the piece. So really, that digitization has affected every aspect of what we're doing. So digital identity will need to as well.
For sure. Fabrice, any concluding remarks for this particular one on the pandemic?
Pandemic, as I think famously Satya Nadella said, Microsoft CEO and chairman, he said, in 2 months we did what we could have done in 2 years for digital. And it's certainly true for digital ID adoption and digital interactions. What I would say is probably people have also become very sensitive in terms of privacy protection, and certainly digital ID and trustable digital ID can go a long way in enabling this privacy to become a reality. And sovereignty is another second very strong driver these days, I would say. Privacy and sovereignty are 2 drivers that have been emphasized probably by the pandemic.
Definitely, indeed. Thank you, Fabrice. So I'm just going to jump now to a couple of questions. We don't have much time left, but I think we've got room for a couple of questions. So I'm just going to pick one here. So what challenges have you faced in working with governments to drive new digital services? I'll throw that to you, Christelle, because I think it's more your area. Would you be able to answer that?
So I would say that one of the challenge government are facing is really to find this right balancing between the security and the convenience. First of all, because on one side, access to some online public services will require some higher security levels than in some other services. So security is really of high importance for governments, especially when you onboard to create a mobile identity and make it a trustable identity. But on the other side of the coin, to win adoption, you also need to deliver on the promises of the digital and make it smooth. So sometimes security doesn't really go hand in hand with convenience. And I would say that's a challenge governments, are facing, and for this they need to find the right supplier for to find this right balance.
Sure, totally understood. Very, very good point there. I'll pick another question. I think this one will be now on the digital identity integration with eSIM to have a full digital experience. Pauline, I think I'll throw that one to you since you're looking at the M&O telco side. Would you be able to get some?
Yes, sure. So the eSIM, the embedded SIM is of course an asset for digitalization compared to the physical SIM. So it can be part, in fact, of a full end user journey where the telecom operator subscribers can verify their identity with some identity verification process, document verification, facial matching, etc. Then download their subscription on their eSIM, activate their subscription. They can pay with a mobile payment solution as well, and manage all their subscription digitally, remotely. So it is really, so this is something which will be really, really quick for the subscriber. You don't have to go to the point of sales to get your SIM. You don't have to wait for the SIM to be sent to you by mail. So you have something which is really digital and where the end user really have the control of all their subscription assets. We cannot hear you, Elson.
Oh, thanks very much, Pauline. Yeah, definitely understand the efficiency that eSIM brings to that space in digital identity. And I think we've only got one more question. So again, apologies. We'll collate the questions and answer them afterwards to those that are still throwing questions at us. But we've got time for one more, and I think I'll pick this one. So what are the biggest challenges in facilitating KYC banks in a purely digital environment? And I'll push that one to you, Arjun.
All right. Well, I think Crystal actually already alluded to it as well, is that one of the main challenges is offering a great user experience while fulfilling regulatory needs. Banks, for very good reasons, they operate in a very heavily regulated environment. For a bank, it is not that easy to adhere to regulations such as anti-money laundering or counterterrorism financing, everything that has to do with the identities of their users. So asking your customer to provide that they are who they say they are creates a barrier for them to be a customer and actually access platforms or consume services. So the friction that this creates in that user experience may very well cause the user to stop their actions. To close a browser window or a mobile app is a lot easier than to walk out of a branch. So making sure that the UX is smooth is absolutely key when it comes to KYC in a purely digital environment. And luckily, we have great solutions available to do so already. And the trends that Fabrice also mentioned, like the European wallet, are only going to make this easier while addressing those regulatory needs. So I think that there's actually a very good time to come when it comes for KYC and banks and in general KYC, because things are going to get easier.
Interesting. Thank you for updating us on that progress, Arjun. And at this point, I think I will hand over back to you, Nick, for some concluding thoughts. Thank you all for the panel discussion questions just now. Thank you. Over to you, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Elson. So then just to sort of sum up what we've talked about, I think we are really set for some dramatic growth in terms of digital identity. There is so much that is exciting in this space, and I think the pandemic has really given the market the impetus it needs and the nudge it needed in the right direction to realize how important digital identity is, and for businesses to really sort out their digital identity verification strategies. I think orchestration, we mentioned it before, is going to be so essential to ensuring an overall secure process, and that really needs to be carefully planned out. But also, diversity in terms of data is really important for digital identity as well. And I think that's something that we're going to see a lot of partnerships, we're going to see a lot of growth in that area going forward. So that's definitely something I think we'll see a lot of announcements about. But other than that, all I'd like to say is thank you for the discussion. It's been great. And please, if you're interested in the topic, download the accompanying white paper on digital identity available from Thales. And that should contain some really interesting thoughts for you. Thanks very much. So that brings us to the end of our webinar. It's been a pleasure to speak to everyone. Thanks, Elson, for hosting, and thank you to Fabrice and all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts on this really interesting area. Hopefully, we will talk with you all again soon, but it's goodbye for now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys.